New York in the early 1990s was loud on the surface and deadly quiet underneath. Sirens echoed through avenues, construction cranes cut the skyline, and Wall Street pulsed with money that never slept. But beneath that noise lived a different kind of power, measured, restrained, and invisible to anyone who didn't know where to look. This was not the era of flashy mob bosses or public executions that filled headlines in earlier decades. This was the age of silence, and Andrew Russo understood that better than most. Russo did not rise through intimidation alone. He did not announce himself with violence or dramatic gestures. His influence grew in whispers, in handshakes behind closed doors, and in decisions that never carried his name. While law enforcement focused on loud criminals desperate for attention, Russo built strength by staying out of sight. In a world where ego destroyed empires, restraint became his weapon. He grew up in a New York shaped by tradition, neighborhoods where family loyalty mattered more than ambition, where respect was earned slowly and never demanded. The streets taught lessons early: speak less, observe more, and never show your full hand. Russo absorbed those rules quietly. While others chased reputation, he studied structure. While others rushed toward power, he waited. The Mafia of the 1990s was changing. Federal investigations were stronger. Surveillance was smarter. Informants were everywhere. The old ways no longer worked. Those who survived adapted. Russo belonged to a generation that understood survival required intelligence, patience, and emotional control. He learned that true power was not about fear, it was about predictability. People trusted what they could rely on, and Russo made himself reliable. His reputation formed slowly, almost invisibly. He was known as someone who listened before he spoke, someone who never overpromised, someone who solved problems without creating noise. When disputes arose, he didn't escalate, he stabilized. In an underworld fueled by chaos, that ability made him valuable. Money flowed through New York like blood through veins: construction contracts, labor unions, real estate deals, and cash businesses that blurred legality. Russo did not chase money recklessly. He positioned himself where money already moved, guiding it quietly. Every decision was calculated, every risk weighed. He understood that survival in organized crime no longer depended on muscle alone. It depended on understanding systems. Unlike violent figures who ruled through fear, Russo ruled through consistency. People around him knew exactly what to expect. He didn't betray trust easily, and he didn't forget disrespect either. His reactions were measured, which made him dangerous in a subtle way. No one could predict when he would act, but they knew when he did, it would be final. Law enforcement struggled with men like Russo. There were no explosive moments to capture, no reckless phone calls, no emotional outbursts. His discipline made him hard to read and even harder to prosecute. While others left trails of evidence, Russo minimized exposure. He delegated carefully, avoided unnecessary meetings, and stayed several steps removed from the consequences of action. Yet this lifestyle came at a cost. Living in silence required constant awareness. Trust was limited. Every conversation was calculated. Every relationship carried risk. Russo's world demanded vigilance, and the price of a single mistake could be permanent. There were no second chances. As the 1990s progressed, pressure increased. Federal cases dismantled long-standing crime families. Former allies turned into witnesses. The illusion of permanence shattered across New York's underworld. Many leaders panicked. Russo did not. He adjusted. He reduced visibility even further, understanding that survival sometimes meant stepping back rather than pushing forward. But restraint did not mean weakness. His influence remained intact because it was never centralized. It was spread through people who owed him stability, favors, and protection, not fear. That kind of power was harder to remove. Even when structures collapsed, the relationships endured. Still, no criminal path ends without consequence. The quiet life does not erase accountability, it only delays it. Every decision leaves a footprint, even when made in silence. The walls always close, and eventually, no matter how careful the architect. This story is not a celebration of crime. It is a study of how discipline, intelligence, and silence can build influence, but also how those same traits can trap a person in a life where freedom slowly disappears. The criminal world promises control but delivers isolation. It promises respect but demands sacrifice, and it never truly forgives. Andrew Russo's story begins not with violence but with restraint. not with noise but with silence, and that silence shaped everything that followed. Power in New York was never given freely. It was taken, negotiated, protected, and most importantly maintained. Andrew Russo understood early that raw aggression created enemies faster than it created loyalty. In the world he navigated, control mattered more than confrontation. The streets rewarded those who could manage pressure without revealing weakness, and Russo learned to master that skill long before others noticed his presence. While many young men around him chased recognition, Russo focused on learning patterns. He observed how money moved, how disputes started, and how small misunderstandings could explode into permanent damage. He watched impulsive men rise quickly and fall even faster. Their mistakes became his education. He learned that impatience was the most expensive flaw a criminal could have. The New York underworld ran on routines. Businesses opened at the same time every day. Meetings followed unspoken rules. Certain streets belonged to certain interests. Russo paid attention to these rhythms. He understood that disruption attracted attention, and attention invited scrutiny. By blending into routine, he reduced risk. His approach to relationships was equally disciplined. Russo never tried to impress. He spoke plainly, avoided exaggeration, and kept his word. In a criminal environment filled with lies and false promises, consistency stood out. People noticed that when Russo agreed to something, it happened exactly as discussed. That reputation became a form of currency more valuable than cash. Trust in organized crime was rare, but predictability created stability. Russo offered stability. He didn't push people into decisions. He let them come to conclusions on their own, guiding conversations quietly rather than controlling them openly. This made others feel respected rather than threatened, and that respect lasted longer than fear ever could. Violence existed, but Russo treated it as a last resort rather than a solution. He understood that every act of violence created waves, retaliation, witnesses, investigations, and internal tension. Avoiding unnecessary conflict was not weakness, it was strategy. When force was unavoidable, it was handled discreetly, without emotion or spectacle. Money, however, was unavoidable. The 1990s were a turning point for criminal finance. Traditional rackets faced increased scrutiny, forcing organized figures to adapt. Russo gravitated toward operations that blended into legitimate commerce, construction projects, labor arrangements, and cash-heavy businesses that masked irregularities behind complexity. These environments rewarded intelligence over aggression. Russo developed a reputation as someone who could resolve disputes without escalating them. When disagreements arose over territory, payments, or obligations, he listened before responding. He understood that most conflicts were fueled by pride rather than necessity. By removing ego from the equation, he prevented small problems from becoming catastrophic ones. Law enforcement pressure increased steadily. Surveillance became more sophisticated. Informants became more common. Russo adjusted his behavior accordingly. He limited conversations, avoided unnecessary exposure, and never assumed privacy. He understood that the safest statement was often silence. In a world where words could become evidence, restraint was protection. Yet living with constant restraint carried psychological weight. Trusting fewer people meant carrying more responsibility alone. Decisions could not be shared freely. Every choice had consequences, and accountability could not be avoided. Russo accepted this burden without complaint, understanding that leadership, even quiet leadership, required endurance. As others around him sought dominance through intimidation, Russo strengthened influence through reliability. People came to him not because they feared him, but because they trusted his judgment. That trust created leverage. When decisions had to be made, his voice carried weight precisely because it was not used often. The illusion of control, however, was fragile. No matter how careful, no criminal system is immune to collapse. Federal investigations dismantled long-standing organizations. Alliances shifted. Old protections vanished. Russo watched these developments carefully, learning from every downfall. He adapted by simplifying operations, reducing exposure, and distancing himself from unnecessary risk. His discipline extended to emotional control. He never reacted publicly to provocation. Insults were ignored. Challenges were absorbed without response. This frustrated opponents who expected confrontation. By denying them reaction, Russo denied them advantage. Silence, again, became a weapon. But silence also isolated him. Relationships outside the criminal world suffered. Normal life became distant. The constant need for caution made relaxation impossible. Freedom, ironically, disappeared long before legal consequences arrived. The lifestyle demanded vigilance, even in moments meant for rest. Russo understood that power built through crime was temporary by nature. He saw men lose everything: freedom, family, identity, because they believed themselves untouchable. That belief destroyed them. Russo never embraced it. He remained aware that the system he operated within was designed to consume its participants eventually. This chapter of his life reveals a deeper truth about organized crime. Intelligence and discipline may delay consequences, but they cannot erase them. Control can manage chaos, but it cannot remove risk. The criminal path offers structure, but it steals peace. Andrew Russo's strength lay not in force, but in self-control. Yet even that strength demanded sacrifice. His story serves as a reminder that true power is not dominance over others, but mastery over oneself, and that criminal power, no matter how quietly built, always comes at a cost. Influence does not announce itself. It forms quietly, brick by brick, through habits that appear ordinary to those who are not paying attention. Andrew Russo understood that lasting power was architectural, not explosive. It required design, patience, and a clear understanding of human behavior. In New York's criminal ecosystem, influence belonged to those who could organize people without forcing them. Russo positioned himself where decisions mattered but visibility remained low. He avoided being the loudest voice in the room. Instead, he became the one others consulted before acting. That role gave him access to information without placing him at the center of risk. Information, he learned, was the most valuable currency of all. Every operation he touched followed a simple principle: reduce friction. Disputes drained energy and attracted attention. Confusion created mistakes. Russo streamlined interactions, clarifying expectations and limiting variables. People appreciated efficiency, even in illegal enterprises. When things ran smoothly, fewer questions were asked. He cultivated relationships deliberately. Not everyone needed to know everything. Information was distributed on a need-to-know basis, limiting damage if someone failed. This compartmentalization protected the structure. While others relied on loyalty alone, Russo relied on design. Loyalty could break. Design endured. Money management reflected the same philosophy. Profits were steady rather than spectacular. Risk was spread rather than concentrated. Russo avoided greed, understanding that excessive gain invited scrutiny. He preferred operations that produced consistent returns without dramatic spikes. Stability reduced attention. The criminal world of the 1990s demanded adaptation. Old hierarchies weakened. Federal pressure disrupted traditional leadership. Russo adapted by remaining flexible. He did not cling to outdated methods or sentimental alliances. He valued effectiveness over nostalgia. Influence also required emotional intelligence. Russo read people carefully. He recognized fear, ambition, insecurity, and pride. He adjusted his approach accordingly. Some people needed reassurance. Others needed boundaries. Few needed threats. Understanding these differences allowed him to manage relationships without confrontation. When conflicts emerged, Russo acted as a stabilizer. He reframed disputes as logistical problems rather than personal attacks. By removing emotion, he reduced escalation. People often agreed with his solutions because they felt practical rather than punitive. This reinforced his reputation as a problem solver. Law enforcement awareness shaped every decision. Surveillance was assumed. Conversations were limited. Meetings were brief. Russo operated as though every moment was observed. This mindset prevented complacency. He understood that safety depended not on luck, but on discipline. Despite his caution, the psychological toll grew heavier. Constant awareness eroded spontaneity. Every interaction carried calculation. Trust remained limited. Russo accepted this reality without complaint, but the weight was undeniable. Power acquired through secrecy demanded isolation. His influence expanded not because he demanded it, but because others depended on it. People relied on his judgment to navigate uncertainty. That dependence created authority. Authority, in turn, created responsibility. Russo carried the responsibility quietly, knowing that failure would ripple outward. Yet even the most carefully designed structure faces stress. External pressure increased. Internal loyalty weakened. Informants destabilized networks. Russo responded by simplifying further. He reduced exposure, delegated selectively, and distanced himself from unnecessary risk. The lesson of this phase was clear. Influence is strongest when it is invisible. Those who seek recognition become targets. Those who seek control through fear create resistance. Russo's method avoided both traps. This chapter illustrates the reality behind organized crime myths. Power is not chaos, it is management. But management in a criminal world remains fragile. No structure is permanent. No design is immune to collapse. Andrew Russo's influence was built with restraint, intelligence, and patience. Yet even the strongest architecture stands on unstable ground when its foundation is illegal. The cost of such influence is not paid immediately, but it is always paid eventually. The greatest threat to quiet power is pressure. Not the sudden kind that shatters glass, but the slow, constant weight that bends steel over time. Andrew Russo learned to operate under that pressure without allowing it to change his outward behavior. In a world where fear often revealed itself through reckless decisions, he practiced control that left no visible cracks. The 1990s brought an era of aggressive enforcement. Investigators no longer chased only the loud criminals. They studied patterns, finances, associations, and silence itself. The absence of noise became suspicious. Russo understood this shift early. He adjusted not by withdrawing completely, but by becoming even more disciplined in how he moved through his world. Every interaction became intentional. Meetings were fewer, shorter, and less predictable. Conversations avoided unnecessary detail. Decisions were made with contingency in mind. Russo assumed that any single point of failure could compromise an entire operation. Redundancy and distance became safeguards. Pressure tested loyalty. As risks increased, some people panicked. Others became careless. Russo observed these reactions closely. He trusted behavior more than words. Those who changed under pressure revealed themselves. Trust, once broken, was never repaired. He quietly restructured relationships, minimizing reliance on instability. Money flow came under increased scrutiny. Financial irregularities that once went unnoticed now triggered investigation. Russo responded by simplifying transactions and reducing complexity where possible. He avoided aggressive expansion. Growth invited attention, and attention brought consequences. Despite his caution, the environment grew tighter. Informants appeared where none were expected. Alliances shifted unexpectedly. Russo responded by detaching emotionally. He stopped assuming permanence. Every relationship became conditional. This mindset preserved safety but deepened isolation. Living under pressure without release required discipline beyond strategy. Russo controlled his reactions meticulously. No visible anxiety. No public frustration. No emotional outbursts. He understood that emotional leakage created vulnerability. Calm, even when artificial, maintained authority. Yet the internal cost was undeniable. Sleep became lighter. Trust became rarer. Silence became heavier. The constant need for vigilance transformed daily life into a continuous calculation. The lifestyle offered control over others but demanded surrender of personal peace. Russo avoided nostalgia. He did not romanticize the past or believe in a return to easier times. He accepted reality as it was. Adaptation replaced tradition. Survival replaced ambition. Pressure also revealed truth about power. Those who ruled through intimidation faltered when fear shifted toward them. Russo's influence, built on reliability, endured longer. People still sought his judgment, not because they feared punishment, but because they trusted outcomes. Even so, no one escaped consequences forever. Pressure accumulated quietly, like water behind a dam. Russo understood that control delayed collapse, but did not eliminate it. Every decision aimed not at victory, but at minimizing loss. This phase of his life demonstrates a critical lesson. Resilience is not loud. It does not announce strength. It simply persists. But persistence in a criminal world requires sacrifice that compounds over time. Andrew Russo carried pressure without sound, but the weight remained. His story reminds us that silence can protect, but it cannot heal, and no amount of control can fully shield a life built in shadows. Invisibility can feel like safety, but it carries a price that is rarely discussed. Andrew Russo built his life around remaining unseen, unheard, and unremarkable to those who looked for obvious threats. This approach protected him from sudden collapse. yet it demanded constant sacrifice. The more invisible he became, the further he drifted from a normal existence. The discipline required to stay hidden was relentless. Every movement was measured. Every word was filtered. Russo avoided routines that could be tracked, yet he also avoided chaos that could draw attention. He balanced between predictability and randomness, knowing that either extreme could become dangerous. The criminal environment thrived on ego, but Russo suppressed his own. He declined public recognition, avoided displays of wealth, and resisted the temptation to assert dominance. This restraint frustrated those who sought validation through hierarchy. Some mistook his silence for weakness. He allowed that misunderstanding to exist, using it as camouflage. Invisibility reshaped relationships. Personal connections became transactional. Trust was extended cautiously and withdrawn quickly. Russo learned to read hesitation, tone, and timing more than words. He relied on instinct sharpened by years of observation. Emotional distance became a survival tool. Yet emotional distance also eroded personal fulfillment. Friendships outside the criminal world faded. Family relationships grew strained. The constant need for secrecy created walls that could not be lowered without risk. Russo understood that protecting others sometimes meant keeping them distant, even when it caused pain. Financial success did not translate into freedom. Wealth required concealment. Spending was restrained. Enjoyment was limited. Every purchase risked visibility. Luxury became a liability. Russo learned that money acquired illegally offered security only in theory. In practice, it chained its owner to caution. The psychological burden intensified. Invisibility demanded vigilance even during rest. The mind never fully relaxed. Every unfamiliar sound triggered awareness. Every unexpected interaction carried potential threat. Over time, this hyper-awareness reshaped identity. Russo became someone who observed life rather than lived it. Despite the isolation, his influence persisted. People relied on him precisely because he was stable and discreet. Problems brought to him were resolved quietly. His reputation for calm decision-making strengthened. Yet each resolved problem added weight, not relief. Invisibility also required moral compromise. Decisions affected lives indirectly. Consequences rippled outward. Russo avoided unnecessary harm, but harm remained inherent to the world he occupied. He rationalized actions as necessary for survival, yet the cost accumulated internally. The longer he remained unseen, the harder escape became. Skills developed for secrecy did not translate easily into normal life. Trust, once restricted, could not be expanded without fear. The lifestyle narrowed options until choices felt predetermined. This phase reveals a paradox. Invisibility protects, but it also imprisons. The absence of attention removes immediate danger but erases identity. Russo's life became defined by avoidance rather than aspiration. His story challenges the myth of criminal success. Power without visibility may delay consequences, but it does not deliver peace. Silence may prevent exposure, but it does not restore freedom. Andrew Russo paid the cost of invisibility daily. His experience serves as a reminder that safety built on secrecy demands a toll that grows heavier with time. True security cannot exist where one must constantly hide. Power in New York did not always roar. Sometimes it whispered. Andrew Russo mastered the art of influence, not through spectacle or fear, but through a subtle web that few recognized until they were already caught within it. This web was not built overnight. It took years of observation, careful action, and a deep understanding of human behavior to weave effectively. To outsiders, Russo's world seemed calm. To those inside, it was a carefully orchestrated network of dependence and control. Russo understood that relationships were the backbone of influence. Each connection, whether through business, family, or neighborhood ties, became a thread in a larger structure. He treated each thread with care, knowing that one broken relationship could unravel an entire operation. Unlike others who relied solely on loyalty or intimidation, Russo relied on reciprocity, reputation, and trust. He made people feel that supporting him was in their best interest, even if they were unaware of how much influence he held. Observation was Russo's greatest tool. He watched for patterns in behavior, listening to what was said, and noticing what was left unsaid. Every hesitation, every repeated action, every small decision revealed information about a person's motives, priorities, and weaknesses. He cataloged these insights quietly, using them when needed to guide negotiations, prevent disputes, or redirect decisions in his favor. Discretion was the lifeblood of the web. Russo avoided taking credit publicly for his actions. He allowed others to believe their ideas had succeeded on their own, or that solutions had arisen naturally. This subtle manipulation ensured loyalty without fear. People followed him not because they were threatened, but because they trusted his judgment, even unknowingly. The strongest webs are invisible, the weakest are loud and brittle. Money, though essential, was secondary to influence. Russo ensured that financial transactions served the broader purpose of control. Investments, loans, or partnerships were structured not only for profit, but to bind individuals into his network. Dependency, carefully calibrated, became a form of leverage. No one resented the help when it came wrapped in discretion and fairness, yet every favor strengthened Russo's position. Conflict management remained a pillar of his approach. Where others escalated disputes through confrontation, Russo diffused them through dialogue and subtle intervention. By reframing problems as mutually beneficial solutions, he maintained stability. When force was unavoidable, it was delivered quietly, leaving no witnesses and minimal attention. Violence, in his philosophy, was a tool of last resort, a measure of control rather than a method of demonstrating power. Adaptation was constant. The 1990s brought increasing federal oversight, evolving surveillance techniques, and the rise of informants within traditional networks. Russo responded by restructuring relationships, rotating personnel, and compartmentalizing information. No single failure could compromise the entire operation. The web became modular, resilient, and self-reinforcing. Despite his success in weaving influence, the lifestyle demanded isolation. Trust was limited, and relationships outside the network were often sacrificed. Russo learned that dependence on a few reliable individuals was safer than broad visibility, yet the fewer connections one held, the lonelier the world became. The weight of responsibility was constant, as even small mistakes could trigger cascading consequences across the network. This careful orchestration extended to perception management. Russo was acutely aware that appearances could be deceiving. He cultivated a public persona of restraint and stability while guiding the underworld with invisible hands. By allowing others to underestimate him, he gained advantage. The most dangerous power is often the one that is invisible until it strikes. Still, every decision carried risk. In a world built on secrecy and subtle influence, a single exposed thread could unravel years of effort. Russo understood that influence without control was fragile, and control without foresight was temporary. The balance between visibility, action, and discretion required constant vigilance. The lesson in this chapter is clear. Lasting power is subtle, patient, and precise. It thrives not on domination, but on orchestration. People may never see the hands that guide them, but the results of unseen influence shape every interaction, every decision, and every outcome. Andrew Russo's subtle web of influence demonstrates that in the quiet corners of New York, power is rarely flashy. It is methodical, disciplined, and built to endure, but it comes at the cost of personal freedom, constant vigilance, and emotional isolation. In the pursuit of control, the individual becomes both the architect and the prisoner of the very system they create. In the criminal underworld, negotiations are rarely public spectacles. They rarely take place at long tables under glaring lights or in front of witnesses. Real negotiation happens quietly, in corners of dimly lit offices, in brief encounters at neutral locations, and in conversations that leave no record. Andrew Russo perfected this art. His reputation was built not on loud declarations or threats, but on the ability to achieve outcomes that others thought impossible without anyone noticing he had moved the pieces. Negotiation for Russo was about understanding leverage, psychology, and timing. He observed that most conflicts arose from miscommunication, pride, or fear. Violence could solve immediate problems, but Russo knew that permanent solutions required more subtlety. By removing emotion from the equation, he allowed logic to guide interactions, and people naturally gravitated toward the outcomes he proposed. Russo's style was deliberate and measured. He never rushed. He never demanded compliance. Instead, he asked questions, listened intently, and allowed the other party to speak first. By giving them the perception of control, he gained insight into their motivations, insecurities, and priorities. He understood that people reveal far more than they intend to, and that knowledge could be leveraged without confrontation. Patience was central to his method. A negotiation could last days, weeks, or months, and Russo never showed frustration. Impatience was dangerous. It signaled weakness, and in a world built on survival, weakness invited attack. He allowed discussions to unfold naturally, guiding them subtly toward resolution. Often by the time the other party realized an agreement had been reached, Russo's influence had already shaped it entirely. Preparation was meticulous. Russo studied relationships, past disputes, financial incentives, and personal ambitions. He anticipated objections, counteroffers, and hidden agendas. When he entered a negotiation, he already understood the landscape. His presence did not dominate, it directed. The environment bent quietly to his understanding of human behavior, and those involved often did not notice the subtle force until the outcome was inevitable. Russo's negotiations extended beyond mere profit or territory. They encompassed alliances, disputes, and protection of long-term stability. He recognized that winning a battle at the cost of long-term disruption was a failure. Each agreement reinforced trust, strengthened networks, and minimized the risk of retaliation. Influence was cumulative, and Russo carefully ensured that every decision contributed to a broader framework of control. Discretion remained a cornerstone of his strategy. Negotiations occurred without witnesses whenever possible. Even trusted intermediaries were carefully chosen and closely monitored. Leaks could destroy relationships and invite law enforcement scrutiny. In a world where words could become evidence, silence was often the strongest asset. Russo's success depended on managing not just people, but information itself. Yet the human cost was always present. Russo's negotiations demanded constant mental effort and emotional restraint. He could not afford impatience, arrogance, or misjudgment. Misreading even a single subtle cue could unravel weeks of careful planning. Each interaction carried weight, each decision reverberated, and mistakes were often unforgiving. The psychological burden of managing human behavior in such high-stakes situations was immense, and it left little room for error. Despite the pressure, Russo understood that restraint created power. Loud, aggressive negotiators may force compliance, but compliance born of fear is fleeting. Agreements built through respect, subtle guidance, and trust endure longer and create loyalty that cannot be bought. He wielded influence quietly, understanding that the most potent victories often went unseen. Financial dealings, territorial disputes, and interpersonal conflicts were all arenas for Russo's negotiation skills. He avoided direct confrontation whenever possible, preferring to redirect disputes toward mutually beneficial solutions. This approach not only minimized risk, but reinforced his reputation as someone whose involvement ensured stability rather than chaos. Even in moments of tension, Russo's calm remained unshakable. His ability to absorb provocation without reaction disarmed opponents. They expected anger or threats and were often unsettled by his neutrality. By denying emotional leverage to others, he maintained control while leaving adversaries unsure of his true position. This unpredictability became a subtle form of power in itself. The 1990s presented unique challenges. Surveillance technology improved, informants became more common, and law enforcement tactics grew sophisticated. Russo adapted by limiting direct interactions, delegating communication, and compartmentalizing sensitive information. The fewer opportunities for observation, the stronger his position remained. His influence expanded not through visibility, but through calculated, hidden channels. Ultimately, Russo's role as a silent negotiator illustrates a fundamental truth about power. It is not always loud or violent. True influence arises from patience, observation, emotional intelligence, and strategic discretion. By mastering these skills, Russo shaped outcomes without drawing attention to himself, leaving both allies and adversaries convinced that agreements had emerged naturally rather than being guided by his design. Yet even mastery carries consequences. Every negotiation demands vigilance, every alliance requires maintenance, and every resolution carries long-term responsibility. Russo bore these burdens without outward complaint, but they contributed to a life constrained by calculation, foresight, and quiet vigilance. The cost of influence, no matter how invisible, is always personal. Andrew Russo's success as a negotiator demonstrates that power can be achieved through intellect, restraint, and subtlety. Influence does not require threats or spectacle. It requires patience, understanding, and an unwavering focus on long-term stability. In the world he inhabited, Silence was strength, and those who listened carefully discovered that the quietest voices often controlled the loudest outcomes. In a city as vast and chaotic as New York, power often comes not from the ability to act, but from the ability to see. Andrew Russo understood this better than anyone. Where others relied on force or reputation, he relied on observation. To him, every street corner, every casual conversation, every glance across a room contained information. The world revealed itself to those who could pay attention, and Russo had honed that skill to near perfection. Observation was not passive. It required active focus, patience, and interpretation. Russo did not simply watch, he analyzed. He noticed patterns of movement, variations in tone, subtle changes in body language, and inconsistencies in stories. Every detail mattered. What appeared trivial to most people, the hesitation in a handshake, the way someone shifted their weight, the timing of an arrival, could contain insight that determined the difference between opportunity and disaster. He spent hours mentally mapping connections between people, businesses, and territories. He cataloged relationships, noting who owed favors, who resented whom, and who could be relied upon in times of crisis. In a world built on hidden networks, these maps were invisible yet essential. Knowledge of relationships gave him leverage, even when he remained silent. Russo's approach to observation extended to behavior under pressure. He watched how people responded to challenges, threats, and uncertainty. Panic, overconfidence, hesitation all revealed vulnerability. He learned to read these subtle cues and anticipate outcomes before others had even formulated their next moves. This skill made him a stabilizing presence in chaotic situations and an unseen force in disputes. Observation also applied to the environment itself. Russo studied the city's rhythm, understanding how timing and location influenced opportunity. He knew which streets carried traffic at certain hours, which businesses could provide discreet access, and where authorities were likely to monitor activity. This spatial awareness gave him advantage in both daily operations and crisis management. Yet the art of observation required discipline. Russo could not allow curiosity to cross into distraction. Each observation had to serve a purpose. He developed an internal filter, distinguishing between relevant and irrelevant information. Mental energy was precious, and he preserved it for details that could affect outcomes. Observation extended to his own behavior as well. Russo monitored his tone, expressions, and physical movements, understanding that others would do the same. He maintained a calm and consistent exterior, avoiding signals that could betray his intentions or emotions. In the world he inhabited, even small gestures could become evidence, and control over one's own presentation was essential. This constant vigilance carried a psychological cost. Russo became hyper-aware of his surroundings, even in personal settings. The ability to relax without losing focus was rare, and every moment carried an element of calculation. Relationships, casual conversations, and public interactions required mental processing that few could sustain indefinitely. Still, the payoff was clear. Survival and influence depended on understanding more than reacting. Observation also allowed Russo to anticipate conflict. By reading subtle tensions, he could intervene before disputes escalated. A misplaced word, an overlooked obligation, or a hidden grudge could otherwise erupt into violence or financial loss. By noticing early warning signs, he prevented problems that others would only see after damage had occurred. Information gathered through observation became a form of currency. Russo used it not as a threat, but as guidance. He subtly influenced decisions, guided actions, and ensured stability, without needing to assert dominance openly. The people around him often believed their choices were their own, unaware of the invisible hand shaping outcomes behind the scenes. The discipline of observation was mirrored by restraint. Russo never shared insights indiscriminately. Information was only valuable when applied strategically. Leaking knowledge could invite suspicion, retaliation, or legal scrutiny. He compartmentalized what he knew, maintaining control over what others could act upon. Yet even mastery of observation could not eliminate risk. Unseen variables, unpredictable human emotion, and external pressures constantly tested him. The key was adaptability. Observation alone did not confer power. It was the integration of what was seen into thoughtful action that ensured success. This chapter demonstrates a fundamental truth. Influence is often invisible, and survival relies more on understanding than on aggression. Those who act without seeing fail. Those who see without acting are powerless. Russo's strength lay in combining both the silent, unblinking observation that allowed him to move decisively when necessary. Andrew Russo's life illustrates that power in the shadows depends not on noise, but on vision. To the untrained eye, nothing happens. But for those who watch, the patterns are clear, the paths are visible, and the outcomes can be shaped. Observation, patience, and discretion were his tools, and in the quiet corners of New York, they were stronger than bullets, louder than threats, and more enduring than reputation. In the fast-moving chaos of New York streets, patience was rare. Most people demanded immediate results, rushed decisions, and sought recognition for every action. Andrew Russo, however, understood that true power was rarely instantaneous. It was cultivated slowly, quietly, and deliberately. Patience was not simply waiting, it was the ability to act strategically, to measure timing, and to allow events to unfold while maintaining control. In Russo's world, patience was more powerful than aggression, more effective than intimidation, and more lasting than reputation. Patience allowed him to see opportunities that others overlooked. While impulsive figures sought immediate gain, Russo observed outcomes over time. He noticed patterns in behavior, financial trends, and conflicts before they became critical. By waiting for the right moment, he maximized the effectiveness of every decision. A single well-timed move often achieved what a reckless person could not accomplish in months. This approach extended to relationships. Russo did not demand loyalty instantly. He earned it by demonstrating consistency and reliability. Others saw him as someone who would not bend under pressure, who would not react irrationally, and who would keep his promises even when inconvenient. Trust, once earned slowly, became unshakable. People relied on him not because they feared him, but because they knew he was dependable. In a world built on deception, that consistency was a rare commodity. Patience also shaped Russo's approach to conflict. Immediate reactions often escalated disputes, leading to unnecessary violence or attention. By waiting, he allowed tempers to cool, emotions to settle, and rational solutions to emerge. Often, a crisis could be resolved simply by holding back, listening, and letting others act first. This restraint created the illusion that problems resolved themselves, while in reality, Russo had guided outcomes from the shadows. Financial and operational patience was equally important. The 1990s criminal landscape was under intense scrutiny from law enforcement, and aggressive expansion could attract unwanted attention. Russo avoided shortcuts. Instead, he focused on sustainable growth and long-term stability. Investments, partnerships, and operations were planned with foresight. He accepted modest gains in the present to ensure security and influence in the future. Patience demanded emotional discipline. Russo trained himself to endure provocation without reaction, to absorb insults without retaliation, and to remain calm under threat. Impatience would have exposed him. Emotional restraint became as valuable as strategic planning. Others who relied on anger or impulsive action often undermined themselves, revealing weaknesses Russo could exploit subtly without confrontation. The ability to wait also allowed him to observe and learn. Russo's patience was not passive. It was an active engagement with the environment. He watched for emerging opportunities, patterns of betrayal, and shifts in power. By staying present and attentive, he could make informed decisions while others acted blindly. Knowledge accumulated slowly, but its value was immense. Patience also shaped alliances. Russo did not rush relationships or commit to untested partnerships. He waited to see who could be relied upon, who acted predictably, and who could navigate pressure without compromising the network. By taking time to assess people carefully, he minimized risk and maximized influence. Relationships became strategic assets rather than liabilities. Yet patience carried its own challenges. The longer he waited, the more he observed, the more he carried the weight of responsibility. Every passing day required vigilance. Decisions delayed could still carry consequences. Patience was not about inaction, it was about purposeful restraint paired with continuous awareness. Russo also understood the power of timing and perception. Many people misinterpret patience as indecision or weakness. Russo used this to his advantage. When others assumed he was passive, he was quietly assessing options, preparing strategies, and guiding outcomes without drawing attention. By the time he acted, the results often seemed inevitable. That perception reinforced his influence and deepened the reliance of those around him. This philosophy extended to law enforcement pressures as well. Surveillance, investigations, and informants were constant threats. Impulsive action could expose the network or draw attention. Russo's patient approach minimized exposure, delayed risk, and ensured that every move was calculated. By waiting, he reduced vulnerability and enhanced control. The principle of patience also influenced his personal life, though with a cost. Relationships outside his network were limited, personal bonds were strained, and opportunities for normal experiences were sacrificed. Patience demanded not only careful timing but also isolation. The more he waited, the more he maintained control, but the more he sacrificed personal freedom and peace of mind. Andrew Russo's life illustrates the often overlooked strength of patience. It is not merely passive endurance, it is a deliberate, strategic tool. It allows observation to translate into understanding, relationships to develop into loyalty, and decisions to manifest into long-term power. In a world dominated by noise, impatience, and spectacle, patience stands as a rare, quiet, and formidable force. Through restraint, calculated observation, and strategic waiting, Russo demonstrated that true influence does not demand immediate recognition. Power earned slowly, maintained carefully, and exercised subtly is more enduring than any display of force. Patience, in this sense, became the cornerstone of his control, quietly shaping the landscape of his world, guiding others without revealing the hand that moved them, and preserving survival in a city where impulsiveness often meant destruction. In the life of Andrew Russo, risk was never something to be avoided entirely, nor was it something to be embraced recklessly. It existed as a constant undercurrent, a force to be measured, studied, and, when necessary, manipulated. Survival in New York's criminal world depended not on brute strength or luck, but on the ability to calculate risk accurately and act with precision. Russo's approach to risk was a defining characteristic of his influence. From a young age, he learned that most people misunderstood danger. They either underestimated it, relying on bravado and impulsive action, or overestimated it, allowing fear to dictate decisions. Russo observed that both extremes led to predictable failure. The reckless became casualties, the paralyzed became irrelevant. He, however, learned to identify where true danger lay, to weigh it against potential reward, and to navigate circumstances without exposing himself unnecessarily. Financial ventures demanded this kind of calculation. Cash flows, investments, and partnerships carried inherent exposure. Aggressive moves could yield rapid profits, but they also attracted scrutiny from law enforcement and rival factions. Russo preferred operations that provided steady, controlled returns rather than flashy gains. He analyzed every factor: the reliability of associates, the visibility of the transaction, the potential consequences of failure. Every decision was deliberate, every risk weighed. Even social interactions carried consequences. A single misplaced word, a revealing gesture, or an unguarded conversation could cascade into exposure, betrayal, or conflict. Russo learned to measure these human variables carefully. He considered motivations, temperaments, and histories before engaging. He avoided impulsive confrontation, using restraint and observation to minimize unnecessary danger. In situations where risk was unavoidable, Russo's method was to compartmentalize. No single failure could jeopardize the larger operation. Teams operated in isolation from one another, information flowed selectively, and contingency plans were always in place. By dividing exposure, he ensured that even when mistakes occurred, the impact could be contained. This approach preserved both stability and personal safety. Russo's understanding of risk extended beyond the operational to the psychological. He recognized that people often act irrationally when under pressure. Fear, anger, and ego could prompt actions that expose vulnerabilities. By anticipating such behaviors, he positioned himself to navigate outcomes with minimal exposure. In negotiations, disputes, or threats, his calm allowed him to act decisively while others reacted emotionally. Timing played a critical role in risk management. Russo knew that the same action could carry wildly different consequences depending on context. Moves that seemed safe in one moment could be fatal in another. Patience and observation provided the data necessary to select the optimal moment. By waiting for the right conditions, he could act with calculated precision. The results appeared almost effortless to those who witnessed them. Law enforcement posed another layer of risk. Surveillance, wiretaps, and informants were constant threats. Russo mitigated these by limiting exposure, avoiding unnecessary communication, and delegating operational responsibilities to trusted intermediaries. He assumed he was always being watched, and his strategies reflected that mindset. Risk was never eliminated entirely, but it could be minimized. Yet even with calculation, no life built on secrecy and crime was without tension. Russo's survival depended on continuous vigilance, mental discipline, and adaptation. Every decision carried potential consequences, and a single misstep could unravel years of effort. This constant calculation became a defining rhythm of his existence. Risk was not abstract, it was immediate, tangible, and ever-present. Despite these pressures, Russo's skill in risk management strengthened his influence. Allies trusted him to navigate dangerous situations. Opponents respected the precision with which he acted. Even those unaware of his presence benefited from his careful planning, as disruptions were anticipated and mitigated before they could escalate. His reputation as a measured, reliable figure became both protective and authoritative. Financially, strategically, and socially, calculated risk allowed him to operate in a landscape where impulsiveness often led to destruction. Russo did not gamble recklessly. Every move was informed by observation, experience, and probability. When he acted, the results reflected foresight rather than chance. That discipline separated him from the majority, making him resilient in a world where the unpredictable could destroy empires overnight. Survival in such an environment required accepting discomfort as constant. Sleep was lighter, decisions were continuous, and trust was limited. Every choice carried potential consequences, and Russo carried them alone. Yet this discipline ensured he endured when others fell. Strength, he understood, was not the absence of danger, it was the mastery of it. This chapter illustrates the critical lesson of calculated risk. True survival is not about avoiding danger completely, but about understanding, measuring, and navigating it. Power in the shadows is fragile without strategy, and influence depends on one's ability to act where others hesitate, and to wait where others rush. Russo's approach demonstrates that the quiet mastery of risk is both a shield and a tool, preserving life while reinforcing authority. Andrew Russo's life shows that survival is an art. It requires vision, patience, and precise calculation. In a city built on chaos, instability, and human ambition, his strength was the ability to recognize opportunity within danger and to act with measured confidence. The balance between risk and reward, exposure and restraint, shaped every choice he made and ensured his endurance in a world where few lasted. In a world built on trust and betrayal, loyalty was the currency that truly mattered. Andrew Russo understood this better than most. He knew that influence and survival were not solely based on intelligence, discretion, or financial acumen. They depended on knowing whom to trust, whom to keep at a distance, and how to enforce boundaries without alienating allies. Loyalty was not demanded. It was earned, observed, and reinforced through consistent action. Russo's life became a careful balance between fostering trust and maintaining control, a balance that required constant attention and unwavering discipline. From the beginning, Russo recognized that loyalty could not be blind. He observed behavior over time, noting how individuals reacted under pressure, distress, or when tempted by opportunity. Words were not sufficient indicators. Actions revealed intentions. A single misstep, even in the form of hesitation or disloyalty, could signify potential danger. Russo learned to act decisively, quietly adjusting relationships to protect his network without creating unnecessary conflict. Boundaries were equally important. Russo understood that influence without clear limits could lead to overreach, exposure, and eventual collapse. He defined what behavior was acceptable within his network and enforced those limits subtly but firmly. Those who respected boundaries became reliable allies, while those who tested them were removed, reassigned, or distanced. Enforcement rarely required violence. His reputation for precision and discretion ensured compliance without dramatic confrontation. The dynamics of loyalty were complex. Russo maintained multiple layers of trust, each carefully compartmentalized. Key associates knew only what they needed to know. Sensitive operations were divided, ensuring that failure in one area did not compromise the whole structure. This system of controlled access minimized vulnerability while reinforcing dependence. People felt empowered within their sphere, yet they remained interconnected through the invisible structure Russo maintained. He also understood the psychology of reciprocity. Loyalty was strengthened when support was extended, but it was carefully measured. He offered guidance, protection, and assistance without creating dependency that could be exploited recklessly. Every favor carried expectation, but it was delivered with discretion, allowing gratitude and obligation to build naturally. Over time, this created a network of individuals whose loyalty was both genuine and self-reinforcing. Conflict management remained central to his strategy. Disputes often arise not from action but from perception. Russo mitigated misunderstandings before they escalated. He listened attentively, mediated subtly, and applied solutions that preserved relationships without exposing himself. The result was stability that appeared effortless to outsiders, but required careful orchestration behind the scenes. Loyalty was also tested by external pressures. Law enforcement, rival factions, and financial stressors created environments where temptation or fear could sway allies. Russo anticipated these risks. He monitored behavior, maintained discreet channels of communication, and acted quietly to reinforce commitments when necessary. Preventive measures were always more effective than reactive ones. This framework of loyalty and boundaries extended to personal interactions as well. Russo recognized that emotional attachment could become a liability. He maintained personal distance when necessary, protecting both his network and his own well-being. Friendship and kinship were balanced with caution, ensuring that trust was not abused and that personal connections did not compromise operational security. Loyalty in Russo's philosophy was never static. It required ongoing reinforcement, observation, and calibration. Allies needed to feel valued and respected, but they also needed to understand that betrayal or negligence carried consequences. Russo's approach was rarely punitive in a dramatic sense. It was preventative, guided by foresight and subtle influence. Those who remained within his framework flourished, while those who drifted were quietly marginalized. Financial, operational, and social decisions were influenced heavily by this principle. Russo avoided overexposure of sensitive information and delegated responsibility based on demonstrated loyalty and competence. By aligning risk with reliability, he ensured that the most critical tasks were performed by those most capable of handling them discreetly. Yet even the most carefully managed network demanded personal sacrifice. Russo's insistence on boundaries and loyalty required vigilance at all times. Every interaction, every decision, and every alliance carried potential consequences. Trust had to be earned constantly, and even minor lapses could compromise stability. The weight of responsibility rested squarely on him, shaping both his behavior and his worldview. This chapter demonstrates a vital lesson about influence and survival. Loyalty is not simply given, and power is not maintained through fear alone. Relationships require careful cultivation, observation, and enforcement of boundaries. In a world where betrayal can come from the most trusted quarters, discretion, consistency, and strategic oversight are indispensable. Andrew Russo's life illustrates that loyalty is a fragile but invaluable asset. By cultivating it deliberately, maintaining boundaries, and reinforcing trust through subtle yet deliberate action, he created a network that could withstand pressure, scrutiny, and conflict. His approach shows that influence is not merely about what you control directly, but about the ecosystem of trust and obligation you cultivate around you. In the shadows of New York, where visibility invites danger, loyalty and boundaries are the invisible scaffolding that sustain power, preserve survival, and protect the architect of the network himself. In the underworld of New York, reputation often served as the first line of defense. Andrew Russo understood that perception could be as powerful as action. Violence, wealth, or influence alone were insufficient. They needed to be underpinned by the belief others held about your character, capability, and reliability. A well-managed reputation acted as both a shield and a tool, deterring threats before they emerged and creating pathways for negotiation and control. Russo's reputation was carefully cultivated over years of disciplined behavior. He avoided impulsive actions, refrained from unnecessary displays of power, and maintained a consistent, measured demeanor. People came to associate him with calm problem-solving, strategic foresight, and reliability. This perception made him a trusted figure, even among those who never worked with him directly. In the streets, perception often outweighed reality, and Russo's attention to this principle allowed him to operate with fewer risks than his more volatile counterparts. Discretion played a central role in reputation management. Russo rarely took credit for actions, even those that advanced his influence significantly. By remaining in the background, he created an aura of subtle authority. Allies and rivals alike saw the outcomes of his decisions but seldom traced them back to him. The impression of inevitability that things resolved smoothly when he was involved strengthened his standing without exposing him to unnecessary danger. Trustworthiness reinforced reputation. Russo made a point of keeping promises, fulfilling obligations, and delivering results quietly. In a world rife with broken commitments and deceit, this consistency stood out. People relied on him because he delivered where others failed. That trust not only protected him but expanded his influence. Allies sought his counsel. Rivals hesitated before challenging him. And even bystanders recognized the reliability of his judgment. The careful cultivation of reputation also acted as a deterrent. Those who considered confrontation or betrayal weighed the consequences of acting against him. Russo's calm, precise approach created uncertainty. Opponents could not predict when or how he would respond, and that uncertainty became a protective buffer. Reputation amplified the effectiveness of his restraint. By being known for deliberate action, he ensured that even silence carried authority. Strategic alliances were strengthened through reputation. Russo's network was built not solely on loyalty or coercion, but on the belief that he was a stabilizing, capable, and discerning leader. Partners knew that cooperation with him would yield steady results, and trust was rewarded with access, support, and discretion. The perception of competence became self-reinforcing as others recognized his abilities. His influence grew and opportunities expanded, all without the need for overt displays of force. Russo also leveraged reputation in conflict resolution. When disputes arose, people deferred to his judgment because they trusted his decisions would be fair, calculated, and effective. He rarely needed to assert power overtly. The respect he had cultivated ensured that his involvement shaped outcomes. Even rivals often sought a quiet understanding rather than confrontation, knowing that underestimating him carried risk. Financial dealings and operational decisions were also protected by reputation. Investors, associates, and intermediaries were more likely to engage in transactions when they believed Russo was competent, discreet, and reliable. In a world where exposure could lead to legal consequences, being seen as careful and principled within the rules of his own system allowed him to move resources with relative safety. Maintaining reputation required constant attention. Every word, gesture, and interaction had potential impact. Missteps could undo years of careful cultivation. Russo monitored himself closely, avoiding displays of emotion that might be misinterpreted, limiting exposure to scrutiny, and addressing small issues before they escalated into threats to perception. Reputation demanded vigilance as much as action, yet the shield of reputation was not infallible. It depended on consistency and the perception of integrity. One visible lapse could invite speculation, challenge, or conflict. Russo understood this and built redundancies into his approach. Actions, alliances, and outcomes were consistently aligned with the persona he projected. The more seamless the alignment, the more resilient the reputation became. This chapter demonstrates a critical lesson about influence. Power is not only about action, it is about how others perceive you. A reputation carefully constructed and maintained deters threats, builds trust, and opens opportunities that overt force alone cannot create. It is both defensive and offensive, a protective barrier and a strategic instrument. Andrew Russo's life illustrates that reputation, when cultivated with patience, discretion, and consistency, becomes a shield that prevents many battles before they begin. It extends influence, fosters loyalty, and preserves survival in a world where visibility can invite danger. In the shadows of New York, the quiet work of shaping perception proved as vital to longevity as any strategic decision, financial maneuver, or calculated risk. In the complex environment of New York's criminal underworld, patience alone was not enough. Andrew Russo knew that while waiting and observing offered security, influence, and insight, there were moments when decisive action was necessary. The true skill lay in balancing patience with timely intervention, understanding when to remain silent and when to act, and ensuring that every move advanced both survival and power. This balance became a defining feature of Russo's life and influence. For Russo, patience was strategic, not passive. He spent years learning the rhythms of people, organizations, and operations. He observed patterns in behavior, anticipated responses, and calculated the consequences of every potential action. This allowed him to delay decisions until the maximum amount of information could be gathered. Impulsivity, he knew, was the enemy of influence. Acting too early often resulted in mistakes, loss of credibility, or exposure. Yet patience without action was equally dangerous. Opportunities in Russo's world were fleeting. Alliances could shift, rivals could move decisively, and law enforcement pressure could change conditions overnight. Waiting indefinitely risked irrelevance or disaster. The key was recognizing the precise moment when action would achieve the greatest effect with the least risk. Russo became a master of timing, knowing not just what to do but exactly when to do it. Observation, a skill honed over years, informed his interventions. Russo never acted without understanding the consequences and the interplay of forces at work. By analyzing the motivations, fears, and ambitions of everyone involved, he could anticipate reactions and shape outcomes without revealing the extent of his influence. It was not about visibility or domination, it was about precise orchestration. His approach extended to financial operations, alliances, and conflict resolution. When a financial opportunity arose, he assessed risk, gauged loyalty, and determined the optimal timing for engagement. When disputes threatened stability, he intervened in ways that appeared natural to others, often guiding decisions indirectly. In every scenario, Russo understood that patience was preparatory, and action was the culmination of observation and calculation. Decisive action required courage as well as intelligence. Russo understood that mistakes could have severe consequences, both legal and social. Every choice had to be weighed against potential outcomes, and contingency plans were always in place. He acted not from instinct alone, but from informed judgment. Even the smallest gestures could have cascading effects, and he respected the responsibility that came with influencing outcomes. Timing was often more important than the magnitude of action. A minor, well-placed intervention could prevent a major conflict. A carefully structured negotiation could resolve a dispute that might have otherwise escalated into violence. Russo prioritized precision over spectacle. The quiet, calculated act often carried far greater long-term impact than any dramatic display of force. This balance also influences relationships. Russo knew when to push, when to guide, and when to step back. People felt both freedom and constraint, autonomy and direction. His subtle guidance created loyalty without coercion. By waiting, he allowed trust to solidify. By acting at the right moment, he ensured respect and reinforced his authority. Allies and rivals alike came to recognize that Russo's interventions were not impulsive, but deliberate, measured, and effective. Even under pressure, Russo's actions were deliberate. Threats, challenges, and unexpected events did not provoke rash responses. He remained calm, calculated, and disciplined. This composure reinforced his reputation and strengthened the impact of every action he took. Silence and patience, combined with precise timing, amplified the effect of his moves, making him seem almost omniscient in the eyes of others. The balance between patience and action also applied to risk management. Russo did not avoid danger entirely, nor did he leap recklessly into it. By waiting for the right moment, he minimized exposure while maximizing influence. Calculated intervention allowed him to shape outcomes proactively rather than reacting to events as they unfolded. This approach ensured that he remained in control, even in unpredictable circumstances. This principle extended to leadership. Russo guided his network without micromanaging, intervening only when necessary. He allowed subordinates to act independently, providing direction subtly, observing outcomes, and stepping in when critical thresholds were approached. By balancing patience and action, he preserved both stability and initiative within his operations. Yet the personal cost was significant. Constant vigilance, mental calculation, and restraint demanded endurance. The weight of responsibility was ever present. Every delay, every decision, and every action carried consequences. Russo accepted this burden without complaint, recognizing it as intrinsic to both influence and survival. Andrew Russo's mastery of balancing patience and action demonstrates a profound truth. Influence is not merely about waiting or acting, it is about knowing when each is required. Timing, observation, and calculated intervention transform patience into power. Silence becomes strategy, and measured action becomes authority. In the shadows of New York, where impulsive decisions could lead to disaster, Russo's ability to harmonize observation, patience, and decisive action became both his protection and his tool for shaping outcomes. Power often appears visible to the untrained eye through force, wealth, or intimidation, but Andrew Russo understood that true control was rarely obvious. It existed in the shadows, in decisions that were never noticed, in influence that guided outcomes without anyone realizing the source. Russo's philosophy was that the quieter the hand, the firmer its grip. The art of control lay not in domination, but in orchestration, subtlety, and anticipation. In the 1990s New York underworld, where visibility invited danger, his invisible hand became the defining mechanism of his influence. Russo never sought recognition. He did not need to be seen to be powerful. In fact, he recognized that being too visible attracted unnecessary scrutiny from both law enforcement and rivals. Instead, he focused on the mechanics of control, understanding who influenced whom, where the pressure points lay, and how to guide decisions indirectly. This form of power was cumulative, strengthening over time as alliances solidified and networks became more dependent on his guidance. Observation underpinned control. Russo cataloged behavior meticulously. He noticed patterns in speech, gestures, and interactions. A hesitation in conversation, a delay in decision-making, or a subtle reaction could reveal intentions, fears, and ambitions. By reading these cues, he anticipated outcomes before they occurred, positioning himself to guide events quietly. This proactive approach prevented crisis and ensured that influence was exercised without overt confrontation. Influence was deployed strategically. Russo often allowed disputes to emerge naturally, letting others act according to their own motivation. He then intervened subtly, providing guidance that shifted outcomes in his favor without revealing his hand. This method minimized exposure while maximizing authority. Allies believed they had reached conclusions independently, while rivals underestimated his role entirely. By remaining unseen, his power became more enduring. Financial operations were an arena where Russo exercised invisible control. Transactions were structured to align incentives, ensure loyalty, and mitigate risk. Every partnership was calibrated so that benefits reinforced dependence, while exposure to danger was minimized. He avoided overt displays of wealth or power, knowing that subtlety protected both operations and reputation. By managing resources quietly, he preserved influence while remaining largely undetected. Psychological mastery was central to this form of control. Russo understood fear, pride, ambition, and insecurity. He leveraged these traits to guide behavior without direct commands. People acted according to their own motivations, yet their paths often aligned with his strategy. This indirect method reinforced trust and minimized resentment. Control achieved through influence rather than force created loyalty that was both genuine and self-reinforcing. Conflict resolution became a demonstration of this invisible hand. Russo rarely confronted disputes openly. Instead, he applied subtle pressure, framed problems as practical solutions, and guided parties toward outcomes that preserved stability. Violence was a last resort, used only when necessary to protect the structure he had built. Most disagreements were resolved before they escalated, illustrating that the power of influence often outweighed the need for visible authority. Risk management reinforced the principle of invisibility. Russo operated under the assumption that surveillance, informants, and unexpected challenges were constant threats. He compartmentalized information, delegated responsibilities carefully, and maintained redundancy in operation. By limiting exposure, he ensured that even mistakes did not compromise the entire network. This approach allowed him to maintain control quietly, without attracting attention. Alliances were maintained through subtle influence rather than coercion. Russo provided guidance, support, and protection while allowing partners autonomy. Decisions were framed so that allies felt they retained control, even as outcomes aligned with his strategic objectives. The more people believed they were independent, the more they relied on his judgment when navigating risk and opportunity. This psychological leverage was central to his model of invisible authority. Adaptation was essential. The underworld of the 1990s evolved rapidly. Law enforcement techniques became more sophisticated, rival factions shifted alliances, and financial scrutiny increased. Russo's invisible hand remained effective because it was flexible. Control was not rigid. It adjusted to circumstances while maintaining the core principle of subtle influence. Those who underestimated him discovered too late that outcomes had already been determined without their awareness. Personal sacrifice was a constant undercurrent. Russo's invisible control required vigilance, mental discipline, and emotional distance. Every action, no matter how small, carried consequences. The mental and psychological demands were relentless, yet the payoff was resilience, longevity, and stability. By remaining unseen, he preserved both his network and his life. This chapter highlights a vital truth. True power is rarely loud. It exists in the ability to guide, influence, and orchestrate outcomes without drawing attention. Visibility often invites risk, whereas subtlety ensures endurance. Russo's mastery of invisible control allowed him to maintain authority, protect his interests, and shape outcomes with precision, all while remaining largely undetected. Andrew Russo's life demonstrates that influence is most enduring when it is exercised without spectacle. The quiet manipulation of events, relationships, and perceptions creates stability and authority that withstands scrutiny, conflict, and change. In the shadows of New York, the invisible hand is stronger than any gun, louder than any threat, and more permanent than any reputation built on fear alone. In Andrew Russo's world, silence was not empty, it was strategic. While most people equated action with power, Russo recognized that true influence often flourished in quietude. The ability to act decisively without drawing attention, to shape outcomes without announcing intentions, and to control situations without overt displays of force became the hallmark of his approach. Silence, in his hands, was both shield and weapon, enabling him to navigate a dangerous landscape with precision and foresight. Russo's strategy began with observation. He listened more than he spoke, recording details in his mind with meticulous care. Conversations, gestures, and even pauses revealed layers of intention that others overlooked. By absorbing information silently, he gained insights into motivations, alliances, and potential threats. While impulsive individuals acted immediately, Russo understood that patience combined with information offered far greater leverage. Knowledge obtained in silence became the foundation of strategy. Decisions were rarely made on instinct alone. Russo weighed risks, predicted reactions, and calculated potential consequences before intervening. Every action was preceded by analysis, ensuring that outcomes aligned with both survival and influence. In this way, silence was never passive, it was preparatory. By remaining quiet, he maintained the flexibility to act decisively when the moment was most advantageous. Silence also protected his reputation. By avoiding unnecessary displays of power, Russo minimized exposure to scrutiny from rivals, associates, and law enforcement. Words spoken in haste could be misinterpreted, creating vulnerabilities or sparking conflicts. By communicating selectively and deliberately, he maintained control over both perception and reality. The fewer the observers, the stronger the strategy. This approach extended to negotiation and conflict management. Russo rarely issued ultimatums or threats. Instead, he guided discussions subtly, letting others feel ownership of decisions while outcomes aligned with his objectives. Silence created space for reflection, allowed emotions to settle, and encouraged rational choices. The quiet hand often achieved results that force or intimidation could never secure. Financial and operational strategy relied heavily on silent planning. Russo structured investments, partnerships, and resource flows in ways that maximized stability and minimized risk. Decisions that appeared spontaneous to outsiders were often the product of weeks or months of silent analysis. By controlling the flow of information and timing of actions, he shaped outcomes while remaining largely invisible. The psychological aspect of strategy in silence was equally important. Russo understood human nature, fear, pride, ambition, and insecurity could all be leveraged to influence behavior. By remaining unreadable, he created uncertainty in both allies and rivals. People acted cautiously, often allowing him to guide outcomes without revealing his influence. Silence, therefore, amplified authority through perception as much as through action. Even in crisis, silence was a tool. Russo did not react impulsively to threats or provocation. Instead, he assessed the situation, anticipated potential responses, and acted at the precise moment that maximized advantage and minimized exposure. This approach not only protected him but reinforced his reputation as calm, deliberate, and unshakable. Allies respected his composure, while opponents hesitated to challenge him. Strategic silence also required emotional discipline. Russo could not afford visible frustration, impatience, or anger. Every reaction was controlled, every expression measured. By masking internal state, he prevented others from exploiting vulnerability. In high-stakes situations, emotional transparency could be fatal. In contrast, silence allowed him to maintain the initiative. Adaptability was essential. The underworld of the 1990s was dynamic, with alliances shifting, law enforcement pressure increasing, and rival factions constantly testing boundaries. Russo's silent strategies were flexible, allowing him to respond without revealing intentions. Planning and observation allowed him to anticipate change and act preemptively, often before others recognized the necessity of action. Yet the practice of strategic silence carried personal cost. Relationships outside his network were constrained, personal interactions were filtered, and mental energy was constantly directed toward assessment and calculation. Russo bore this weight with discipline, understanding that the long-term benefits of strategic silence outweighed the short-term sacrifices. Every moment of restraint contributed to influence, stability, and survival. This chapter underscores a critical principle. Power is often quieter than it appears. True influence does not require bluster, threats, or public recognition. The ability to listen, observe, and act deliberately creates control that is both durable and difficult to challenge. Silence amplifies strategy, reduces vulnerability, and ensures that actions carry maximum impact with minimal exposure. Andrew Russo's mastery of strategic silence demonstrates that influence is not always seen, yet it shapes every outcome. Decisions made quietly, actions executed with discretion, and authority exercised without announcement are more enduring than force displayed openly. In the shadows of New York, where visibility invites danger and impulsivity invites failure, silence is both shield and sword, enabling the quiet architect to guide, protect, and endure. Power often convinces people it must be visible to be effective. But Andrew Russo understood a different truth. The most enduring influence often goes unnoticed. Visibility attracts attention, scrutiny, and risk, whereas subtlety creates stability, loyalty, and enduring authority. Russo's genius lay in his ability to shape events, control networks, and manage outcomes without ever being seen as the central force. Influence without visibility became both his signature and his protection. From the start, Russo recognized that overt displays of power create vulnerabilities. Threats, aggression, or flamboyant control draw attention from rivals eager to challenge strength and from law enforcement eager to intervene. In contrast, influence exercised quietly can bend situations to one's will while remaining largely undetected. By allowing others to perceive autonomy in their actions, he guided outcomes without confrontation, creating loyalty and trust without coercion. Observation remained central to this strategy. Russo cataloged behaviors, alliances, and relationships, noting subtle indicators of ambition, fear, or uncertainty. Every conversation, pause, and gesture held significance. By understanding human behavior deeply, he could anticipate decisions, redirect conflict, and guide outcomes, all without asserting visible control. The more unseen his hand, the stronger its effect. Russo deployed influence in almost every aspect of his operations. Disputes were diffused before they escalated. Alliances formed naturally, and resources were managed in ways that reinforced stability. People believed their actions were independent, unaware that the structure around them subtly shaped choices. This approach minimized resistance and maximized loyalty, while protecting Russo from unnecessary exposure or retaliation. Financial operations benefited greatly from invisible influence. Russo structured investments, cash flows, and partnerships so the dependencies were created naturally. Allies grew reliant on his guidance, not through threats, but through the practical advantages of alignment. By remaining behind the scenes, he maintained flexibility and reduced the risk of scrutiny, ensuring long-term sustainability of both wealth and authority. Negotiation became a critical arena for this form of control. Russo rarely overtly pressured counterparts. Instead, he asked the right questions, allowed others to express priorities, and subtly redirected discussions toward outcomes that served his objectives. By making his partners feel as if they retained control, he strengthened relationships while guiding decisions in his favor. Influence without visibility relies on perception as much as action. People must feel independent even as their decisions align with the orchestrator's plan. Psychological insight was central to his invisible influence. Russo understood fear, ambition, pride, and insecurity not as weaknesses to exploit openly, but as levers to guide choices indirectly. By shaping perception and subtly highlighting consequences, he could encourage desired actions without revealing intent. The effect was profound. Allies performed effectively, rivals hesitated, and external observers underestimated his role entirely. Crisis management also benefited from this principle. When disputes or threats arose, Russo often intervened quietly, resolving situations before they escalated. By applying guidance subtly, he maintained control while avoiding public exposure. The fewer people recognized his involvement, the stronger the stability he created. In high-stakes environments, invisibility became an asset that amplified both security and influence. Even interpersonal relationships were managed under this principle. Russo maintained distance where necessary, allowed autonomy among trusted associates, and limited information flow. By compartmentalizing knowledge and controlling perception, he ensured that influence remained subtle but effective. Allies felt empowered, while the network remained resilient and adaptive under his quiet guidance. Yet influence without visibility required constant discipline. Russo monitored behavior, anticipated reactions, and adjusted strategies continuously. One misstep, an unguarded comment, a visible gesture, or misjudged reaction could compromise authority. The invisible hand demands vigilance. Power is not inherent, but maintained through attention, restraint, and calculation. This approach also allowed for longevity. In a world where overt displays of force can provoke retaliation, subtle influence endures. It builds systems that operate efficiently, alliances that are self-reinforcing, and networks that function even if the orchestrator reduces visible activity. Russo's ability to shape outcomes quietly ensured that his authority persisted even amid shifting circumstances, rival ambitions, and law enforcement scrutiny. The personal cost, however, was significant. Russo's constant vigilance, restraint, and emotional discipline create isolation. Relationships outside his network were limited, personal interactions were carefully filtered, and leisure was minimal. Yet the long-term payoff of a resilient network, enduring influence, and personal safety justified the sacrifices. The invisible hand may be lonely, but it endures where visible displays of power fail. Andrew Russo's life illustrates a profound lesson. Influence does not require recognition to be effective. Strategic subtlety, careful observation, and psychological insight allow control to persist in ways that overt action cannot achieve. In the shadows of New York, the most effective power is unseen, the most enduring authority is quiet, and the most skilled operators guide outcomes without ever needing the spotlight. Through invisible influence, Russo shaped alliances, resolved conflicts, and secured long-term stability, all while maintaining discretion, minimizing risk, and reinforcing loyalty. In a world of visibility-driven chaos, the unseen strategist prevails, demonstrating that subtlety, patience, and control often outweigh aggression, spectacle, and impulsive action. In the world Andrew Russo navigated, resilience was not optional, it was essential. The streets of New York were unpredictable, alliances were fragile, and threats emerged from every direction, often without warning. Russo understood that survival depended on more than intelligence, patience, or subtle influence. It required an inner fortitude, the capacity to endure setbacks without losing focus, and the ability to adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining control. Resilience became his most reliable asset, the quiet engine that powered his continued influence. Resilience for Russo was cultivated early, shaped by observation and experience. He had seen impulsive figures rise rapidly and fall just as quickly. Others relied solely on strength or reputation, believing that intimidation could shield them from consequence. Russo realized that the world did not reward bravado, it punished unpreparedness. Endurance, careful preparation, and mental discipline were the qualities that ensured longevity. In a city where fortune and misfortune could shift in a single night, resilience was the margin between survival and disaster. Part of his resilience came from control over his own responses. While others reacted emotionally to provocation, insult, or threat, Russo maintained composure. He had trained himself to evaluate every situation calmly, to consider consequences before action, and to respond strategically rather than impulsively. This emotional steadiness not only prevented unnecessary mistakes but also reinforced his reputation as a figure of authority and reliability. Those around him began to recognize that he was unshakable, and that perception created additional layers of protection. Resilience was equally a matter of preparation. Russo understood that crises were inevitable. Conflicts, betrayal, law enforcement pressure, and financial volatility were constants in his environment. To endure, he built redundancies in operations, diversified partnerships, and developed contingency plans. No single failure, betrayal, or unforeseen event could dismantle the structure he had painstakingly constructed. This foresight allowed him to face challenges with confidence rather than fear. Adaptation was a core component of resilience. The criminal landscape of New York in the 1990s was dynamic. With shifting alliances, law enforcement pressure, and economic volatility creating a constantly evolving environment, Russo's survival depended on his ability to adjust strategies in real time, to pivot when circumstances demanded, and to remain fluid while preserving core objectives. Flexibility was not weakness, it was strength applied intelligently. Resilience also had a psychological dimension, the mental burden of constant vigilance. Strategic planning and operational oversight was immense. Russo developed coping mechanisms that allowed him to endure stress without compromising judgment. He compartmentalized emotions, separating personal attachment from professional necessity, ensuring that no single setback destabilized his composure. By managing internal pressures, he maintained clarity and effectiveness, even in high-stakes situations. Loyalty and trust contributed to resilience. Russo carefully cultivated networks of reliable allies who understood their roles and shared aligned interests. Dependable associates provided support in operations, shared intelligence, and acted predictably under pressure. By investing in relationships with patience and discretion, Russo strengthened both his operational stability and his ability to endure external shocks. Reliable alliances amplified resilience, while instability among associates could have cascading consequences. Physical preparedness complemented his mental resilience. Russo maintained routines that preserved alertness, stamina, and readiness. In a world where unexpected confrontations could arise at any moment, physical and mental readiness were inseparable. Endurance, in both senses, became an essential survival skill, ensuring that when threats appeared, he could act decisively and effectively. Russo's resilience also manifested in his ability to absorb failure without losing momentum. Mistakes, minor setbacks, or betrayals were inevitable in a world as volatile as his. What distinguished him from others was the ability to learn from these incidents without becoming reactive or reckless. Each challenge became a source of insight, an opportunity to refine strategy, and a test of discipline. Resilience in this sense was both protective and generative, strengthening influence over time. Social perception reinforced resilience. By maintaining a calm and measured presence, Russo created an image of unshakable authority. Allies felt confident following his guidance, rivals hesitated to test his limits, and external observers underestimated his reach. The psychological power of appearing unflappable served as a shield, deterring challenges and reducing threats before they materialized. Visibility of resilience became an indirect form of control. Yet resilience demanded personal sacrifice, emotional distance, constant vigilance, and relentless attention to detail imposed isolation. Russo accepted these costs as necessary for survival and long-term influence. The personal discomfort was outweighed by the ability to maintain networks, protect interests, and navigate dangers with precision. Endurance was not passive, it was a deliberate cultivation of strength, awareness, and adaptability. Resilience was ultimately about maintaining agency. Russo faced circumstances that could have easily dictated his actions: law enforcement pressure, rival aggression, and internal disputes. But by combining foresight, discipline, and mental fortitude, he remained in control, shaping outcomes rather than reacting to them. The capacity to endure, adapt, and influence despite adversity became the cornerstone of his authority. Andrew Russo's life demonstrates that survival in a high-risk environment requires more than intelligence, observation, or patience. Resilience, mental, emotional, and operational, is the foundation that allows influence to persist amid chaos. The ability to absorb shocks, adapt to change, and maintain composure transforms challenges into opportunities and uncertainty into control. In the shadows of New York, resilience was not visible, but it was the force that sustained power, preserved life, and ensured that influence endured where others faltered. In the life of Andrew Russo, power and survival were not measured solely by immediate gains or personal wealth. They were defined by the enduring impact he left on his world. Legacy was not about monuments, headlines, or recognition. It was about the subtle, lasting influence that shaped decisions, behaviors, and structures long after his direct involvement had ended. Russo's understanding of legacy was deeply intertwined with the principles he had cultivated: patience, discretion, strategic silence, and the invisible hand of control. Russo recognized early that life in New York's underworld was transient. Alliances shifted, loyalties were tested, and circumstances could change overnight. Immediate success was fleeting. What endured was the ability to create systems, relationships, and influence that persisted beyond any single moment. He sought to shape outcomes so thoroughly that his presence would remain felt, even when he was not visible. Legacy, in his world, was influence crystallized into stability. Every decision Russo made was guided by consideration of long-term consequences. Financial operations, partnerships, and alliances were structured with endurance in mind. By reinforcing loyalty, minimizing exposure, and anticipating change, he ensured that each component of his network could function effectively without requiring constant intervention. This allowed him to extend his influence quietly and strategically, solidifying his role as the architect of outcomes rather than the executor of visible force. Russo also understood that a legacy required trust and reliability. Reputation was more than perception. It was the foundation upon which long-term influence was built. By consistently delivering on promises, demonstrating competence, and acting with discretion, he cultivated networks that remained cohesive under pressure. Allies continued to follow principles he had instilled. Rivals hesitated to challenge systems he had structured, and even external observers operated within the framework shaped by his decisions. Legacy, in this sense, was both cultural and operational. Strategic mentorship and guidance were also part of his enduring influence. Russo recognized that the knowledge, discipline, and insight he possessed could not be concentrated solely in himself if it were to endure. Trusted associates were trained subtly, learning through observation, responsibility, and modeled behavior rather than explicit instruction. By embedding principles of patience, calculated risk, and discretion into the next generation, he ensured that his approach to influence would persist even as direct control waned. The silent orchestration of events was central to this legacy. Russo rarely sought credit, preferring instead that outcomes appeared natural or self-generated by those involved. Allies achieved goals and navigated crises believing their actions were autonomous. Yet these actions were guided subtly by his frameworks. This method reinforced both loyalty and operational efficiency, while leaving the architect largely invisible, ensuring that his principles endure without the need for public recognition. Adaptation was another critical element of enduring influence. Russo's strategies were designed to be flexible, allowing networks to respond effectively to shifting pressures from law enforcement, rival factions, and financial volatility. By embedding adaptability into the structure he created, he ensured that the systems he influenced could survive disruption. Legacy for Russo was not rigid preservation, it was resilient evolution guided by principles he had established. Resilience cultivated over decades strengthened the durability of his impact. Systems, alliances, and relationships were designed to absorb setbacks without collapsing. By compartmentalizing risk, reinforcing trust, and distributing authority, Russo created an environment where influence could endure even when external forces challenged the network. His legacy was not static, it was alive, resilient, and capable of self-preservation. Psychological insight amplified the reach of his influence. Russo understood motivations, fears, and ambitions at both individual and organizational levels. By leveraging these insights subtly, he guided decisions and behaviors in ways that reinforced stability and loyalty. Influence extended beyond explicit instruction, permeating interactions and decisions long after he had moved on. His guidance became embedded in the culture of his network, ensuring long-term alignment with his principles. The personal cost of building such a legacy was significant. Russo's life demanded vigilance, discipline, and emotional restraint. Relationships outside his network were constrained, leisure was limited, and the mental load of continuous observation and strategic planning was immense. Yet these sacrifices were accepted as necessary for the creation of enduring influence. Legacy, he understood, required sustained investment, careful cultivation, and unyielding commitment. The culmination of Russo's approach was the realization that influence could outlast visibility. Power exercised through subtle guidance, strategic silence, and carefully nurtured relationships endures far longer than dominance displayed openly. The networks, principles, and behaviors he shaped became extensions of his presence, ensuring that even in absence, his hand guided outcomes, shaped decisions, and maintained stability. Andrew Russo's life illustrates that true legacy is not measured by immediate recognition or material gain. It is measured by the enduring influence one leaves on systems, networks, and people. By combining patience, discretion, resilience, and subtle guidance, he ensured that his principles continued to shape outcomes long after his direct involvement. In the shadows of New York, where visibility invites danger and impulsivity invites failure, a carefully constructed legacy of influence endures, quietly reinforcing stability, loyalty, and the structures of power. Ultimately, Russo's legacy is a lesson in the power of invisible influence. Enduring authority does not require spectacle, immediate recognition, or constant intervention. It requires foresight, discipline, subtlety, and the capacity to shape environments so that principles continue to guide decisions, relationships, and outcomes long after the architect has stepped away. In a world where many rise and fall in the glare of visibility, the enduring influence of the unseen strategist proves more powerful than any fleeting display of strength. As Andrew Russo's life unfolded in the shadows of New York, it became clear that his greatest legacy was not power, wealth, or notoriety, but the lessons embedded in his choices and approach to life. Every decision, every subtle intervention, every carefully measured risk contributed to a framework that went beyond immediate survival or influence. It offered a template for understanding human behavior, leadership, and resilience in high-stakes environments. The final chapter of Russo's story is not about dramatic confrontation or sensational events. It is about reflection, insight, and the enduring wisdom of a life lived with deliberate purpose. Russo's existence was a study in discipline. He demonstrated that endurance is not a product of luck or raw strength, but of meticulous preparation and mental fortitude. In a world where impulsivity leads to failure, he exhibited restraint in thought and action. Decisions were never hurried. Every option was evaluated for risk, reward, and long-term consequence. This discipline created consistency, a critical element in both influence and reputation. By maintaining unwavering standards for himself, Russo cultivated trust among allies, deterred adversaries, and ensured that his actions carried weight and authority. One of Russo's most profound lessons was the value of observation. He listened before speaking, watched before acting, and waited for patterns to emerge before making strategic moves. In doing so, he turned information into power. Every conversation, gesture, and hesitation became data, and careful analysis of these details allowed him to anticipate behaviors and shape outcomes. Knowledge, acquired quietly and without fanfare, became the cornerstone of his influence. Through observation, Russo demonstrated that understanding others is often more powerful than confrontation, and foresight more valuable than immediate action. The principle of patience remained central to his philosophy. Russo knew that timing could magnify success or prevent catastrophe. Waiting for the optimal moment to act required confidence, self-control, and a long-term perspective. Many succumbed to the temptation of immediacy, rushing into decisions driven by ego, emotion, or ambition. Russo, however, waited and measured, allowing circumstances to reveal the best course. Patience, coupled with insight, became an instrument of both safety and effectiveness. At the heart of his approach was the concept of invisible influence. Russo rarely relied on overt displays of power. His strength lay in guiding events and people without exposing his hand. This method reinforced loyalty, minimized risk, and preserved autonomy within his network, while ensuring outcomes aligned with his objectives. Influence exercised quietly proved far more durable than authority imposed through intimidation or spectacle. By shaping behavior and decisions subtly, Russo demonstrated that true power often operates unseen. Loyalty and trust were central to Russo's enduring success. He cultivated relationships that were reciprocal, measured, and reinforced by shared interest and mutual respect. Loyalty was not demanded, it was earned and observed. By establishing boundaries and reinforcing them consistently, Russo created networks that were resilient under pressure. He understood that influence is strongest when it is built on reliability and trust, rather than coercion, and that relationships must be managed carefully to endure in high-risk environments. Risk, of course, was inevitable. Russo's life was defined by constant exposure to danger, financial, legal, and personal. Yet his ability to navigate risk with precision ensured survival and sustained influence. He compartmentalized exposure, anticipated threats, and acted decisively only when necessary. The careful balance of risk and reward was a defining feature of his strategy, demonstrating that caution and courage are not opposites but complementary elements of effective decision-making. Resilience threaded through every aspect of Russo's life. He endured setbacks, learned from failures, and adapted to changing circumstances with unwavering determination. Challenges were inevitable, yet he transformed obstacles into opportunities for observation, refinement, and strategic intervention. This resilience reinforced both his influence and his personal survival, proving that the ability to persist under pressure is as valuable as intelligence, strength, or skill. Perhaps Russo's greatest lesson was the importance of legacy. He understood that the structures he built, the principles he instilled, and the subtle influence he exercised would outlast his direct involvement. Enduring authority does not require visibility. It requires foresight, careful cultivation, and the embedding of values into networks, systems, and relationships. By shaping the behavior of those around him and ensuring systems could operate independently, he created a legacy of stability and influence that extended far beyond his presence. Education, reflection, and subtle mentorship were tools he used to extend this legacy. Trusted associates absorbed lessons not through direct instruction but by observing his principles in action. Discipline, patience, subtlety, and resilience were transmitted organically, ensuring that the values underpinning his influence became embedded in the culture of his network. Russo's life demonstrated that the most enduring power is not imposed but taught, lived, and exemplified. As his story draws to a close, the ultimate lesson emerges: influence, survival, and legacy are not achieved through spectacle, impulsivity, or domination. They are built through careful observation, strategic patience, disciplined action, and subtle guidance. Authority exercised quietly, with foresight and precision, creates systems, relationships, and outcomes that endure beyond any individual. True power lies not in being seen, but in shaping the world in ways that others recognize only after the impact has been made. Andrew Russo's life, lived in the shadows of New York, illustrates that strength is not always loud, and survival is not always visible. Discipline, resilience, trust, patience, and invisible influence form the pillars of enduring authority. The final lesson is clear. The quiet, deliberate, and strategic life often leaves the most profound impact. Decisions made with foresight, actions executed with precision, and influence exercised subtly can create a legacy that lasts far beyond the immediate, demonstrating that enduring success comes not from impulse or aggression, but from wisdom applied consistently over time. Russo's story serves as a reminder that every choice, every interaction, and every act of restraint can contribute to a life of influence, stability, and meaning. In the shadows, where threats are constant and visibility invites danger, it is the disciplined, patient, and strategic individual who endures and whose lessons continue to resonate long after the final move has been made.